Okay, buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into this mind-bending concept called semantic closure. You sent me some seriously intriguing research on this, articles, studies, even some handwritten notes. Looks like we're going deep into the deep dive here.
Absolutely, but I promise it's worth it. Semantic closure, it gets to the heart of how meaning emerges from the physical world. Like, it's this intricate dance between matter and meaning. And this dance plays out everywhere from the chemistry of life to, like, the inner workings of AI.
Okay, intricate dance. I like that. But how about we break it down a bit? What exactly is semantic closure?
So imagine a system, any system really, where the physical parts and the what you might call meaning-making parts are kind of, locked in a feedback loop. That's semantic closure in a nutshell. One of the articles you shared, actually, it uses this term, constraint closure.
Constraint closure. So like a closed loop where everything's interconnected and
Exactly. Think of it like a complex machine. Each gear is both controlled by and, at the same time, controlling the gears around it. Everything's interdependent. You get it.
okay, yeah, I'm starting to get a visual here.
Good. Now take that visual and apply it to, say, like a chemical reaction. You have a molecule, let's call it A, that transforms into molecule B. That transformation is governed by an enzyme, E1. But here's the twist: molecule B then that circles back and acts as a constraint on a different reaction. And this other reaction is responsible for producing enzyme E1 in the first place.
Whoa. So it's like a closed loop, a self-sustaining cycle, where each element is what both a cause and an effect.
Precisely. And this concept of constraint closure, it's how some scientists believe life itself arose from lifeless chemistry.
Hold on, we're going from gears and molecules to the origins of life. That's quite a leap.
That's the beauty of semantic closure, right? It connects these seemingly totally disparate phenomena in surprising ways. See, the universe, it tends towards entropy, things becoming more disordered over time. It's like, think about a messy room. It doesn't just tidy itself up, right? You need some external force acting upon it.
Sadly, yeah, I know that all too well.
Right. But life seems to defy this tendency towards disorder. Living organisms, they're incredibly organized, these self-sustaining pockets of complexity, and this is where constraint closure comes in. Those self-sustaining cycles, those feedback loops, they pull the system away from chaos. They create this space where order and complexity can emerge and, most importantly, endure.
So it's like these loops, these like interdependencies. They're creating these little havens where the universe's usual rules don't quite apply in the same way. And that's what allows life to exist.
Exactly. And we see this playing out in biology all the time. Think about the intricate dance of enzymes regulating metabolic pathways within a cell. Each step constrained by the one before it, creating this self-regulating system that maintains the organism's stability.
So if we zoom out from the level of cells and enzymes, could this same principle of constraint closure of these feedback loops creating order, could that also explain how something as complex as life itself emerged from the primordial soup?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while we can't definitively say yes just yet, constraint closure offers a compelling framework for understanding how those first self-replicating molecules might have, organized themselves into increasingly complex systems, eventually giving rise to life as we knew it.
Okay, so we've gone from molecules to life itself, all thanks to this idea of constraint closure. This is already blowing my mind. We're just getting started. But before we dive into how this applies to AI and even our own use of language, maybe we can unpack this idea of constraint closure a bit further. So we've seen how this dance between constraint and closure might have even like choreographed the very first steps of life. But what about the digital world? Could this same principle be at play in how AI systems, how they're developing? I mean, it seems like a huge leap from enzymes to algorithms.
It might seem like a leap, yeah, but the underlying principles are surprisingly similar. Remember how we talked about ChatGPT, that language processing powerhouse? Well, it actually illustrates semantic closure beautifully, even without a physical body.
Wait, how can something that exists purely as lines of code, how can that demonstrate a concept that's, rooted in the physical world?
That's the fascinating part. Think about it. ChatGPT's code, that's the material aspect, right? Well, that code enables it to process language, to understand it, generate it. That's the symbolic part, you see. But here's the kicker. The language that it generates, those symbolic outputs, they can actually influence and change its own code. So over time, it's refining its algorithms.
So ChatGPT is like learning and evolving based on the language that it's exposed to. It's like it's creating meaning from its interactions, even though it's just code.
Exactly. And that continuous interplay between the code and the symbols it's manipulating, that's a form of semantic closure, right? And, it's not entirely different from how our brains work. We're using electrical signals and neural networks to process information and generate meaning.
Okay, that's making my brain do a bit of a loop itself, but I think I'm following you.
Right, yeah.
But are we saying that ChatGPT is actually alive in the same way that, like, a biological organism is?
Now, that's a question that philosophers and AI researchers are grappling with right now, and it might be, a bit too early to give a definitive answer. But what we can say is that semantic closure might hold the key to understanding how complex systems, biological or artificial, how they develop that capacity for meaning making, and how they even exhibit something that, well, resembles intelligence.
That's incredibly exciting and a little bit unnerving, to be honest. So we've gone from cells to AI, both demonstrating this principle of semantic closure. But what about us? How does this play into how we use language, how we create meaning in our, like, everyday lives?
Well, there's this really intriguing idea from cognitive scientist Nick Chater. I think you'll appreciate this. He compares language to an improvisational game, like charades.
Oh, I love charades. I'm always amazed at how quickly people can get, like, complex ideas across with just gestures and facial expressions.
Exactly. And Chater argues that that's essentially what we do with language all the time. We're constantly inventing, reinterpreting, building upon these shared conventions to express ourselves. Language isn't this static set of rules. It's fluid, dynamic. It evolves through our interactions.
So we're all just making it up as we go along.
In a way, yes, we draw upon this shared understanding, sure, but we're also constantly pushing the boundaries, introducing new words, phrases, even using emojis in creative ways. And that's where semantic closure comes back in. Each time we communicate, we're taking these physical symbols, words, gestures, emojis, and using them to create this shared meaning.
So it's like we're building this massive, ever-changing dictionary of shared meaning. But it's not actually written down anywhere. It exists purely in how we use language together.
You got it. Chater calls this our symbolic landscape. It's this constantly evolving terrain that we create through language. And it's this symbolic landscape that allows us to align our individual experiences, to make sense of the world together, even though, our internal experiences are subjective and unique.
I love that the symbolic landscape. It's like we're all explorers in this shared mental world, constantly charting new territory as we communicate. But we also have to deal with situations where we encounter new information, right? Ideas that don't neatly fit into our existing symbolic maps. So how do we handle that?
That's where another fascinating piece of this puzzle comes in, abduction.
Abduction,
Yeah.
like kidnapping. Okay,
Oh.
now things are getting a bit dark.
No, no, not that kind of abduction. In this context, abduction is a way of thinking. It's about generating new hypotheses, new explanations from limited evidence. Think of it like a detective, piecing together clues to solve a mystery.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Okay, imagine a doctor trying to diagnose a patient. They gather symptoms, right, which are like pieces of evidence, and then they use their knowledge and experience to make an educated guess about what might be causing those symptoms.
So it's like making an informed leap of logic based on incomplete information.
Exactly. And we do this all the time, not just doctors. It's how we navigate a world full of ambiguity, full of uncertainty. We're constantly forming hypotheses, testing them against new information, refining our understanding as we go.
This is all starting to connect. You're saying that this abductive reasoning, this ability to make these leaps of logic, that it's related to semantic closure.
Precisely. Semantic closure is what allows us to connect those dots, to make those intuitive leaps from physical signals like words or symptoms to their symbolic meaning. We're drawing on those shared symbolic landscapes, those mental models that we've built through language and experience to fill in the gaps.
This is blowing my mind wide open. We've gone from the origins of life to the inner workings of AI to how our brains make sense of the world, all through this lens of semantic closure. But before we get too carried away with all this mind-bending stuff, let's bring it back down to earth for a second.
Yeah.
We talked about how AI systems like ChatGPT are already demonstrating semantic closure. But what about those more, shall we say, ambitious AI developments you mentioned earlier? You mentioned some research about AI systems that can actually improve their own code, like they can actually rewrite their own programming. Those were the ones with the cool names, right? Something like Stoppy and what was it, Prompt Breeder.
Those are the ones. And no, they're not heavy metal bands, though I agree, they totally could be. But they're actually quite fitting as names go. Both StubP and Prompt Breeder, they illustrate how AI is starting to really blur the line between, the physical and the conceptual, the very essence of semantic closure, really.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. How do these programs actually work?
So S.P uses a process that's kind of similar to like evolution, So it's given a goal and then it constantly tests and refines its own code to achieve that goal. But here's the mind-blowing part. It does this without ever being explicitly taught how to code. Isn't that wild?
So it's like teaching itself to be a better programmer. It's like, I don't know, watching a toddler figure out how to hotwire a car. It's impressive and a little bit unnerving at the same time.
That's a great analogy. Is like, yeah, giving a child a set of those building blocks and them figuring out how to build a skyscraper without ever seeing a blueprint. Pretty amazing, huh?
Okay, that's seriously impressive. But what about Prompt Breeder? What's its claim to fame?
Prompt Breeder focuses on something you're probably already pretty familiar with. You know those little prompts we give to language models, like when we're using ChatGPT?
Yeah.
You know how you sometimes have to, like, phrase a question in just the right way to get a helpful answer from a search engine?
Ugh, don't get me started. I swear, I spent half my life trying to outsmart search algorithms.
Exactly. Well, Prompt Breeder essentially automates that process.
Huh.
So it's constantly experimenting with different ways of phrasing prompts, you see, trying to figure out what gets the most effective responses from these AI systems.
So it's like an AI system that's, what, becoming a better communicator, learning how to use language more effectively to get what it wants. Huh.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. And that's why these developments are so significant. We're talking about AI systems that aren't just, passively following instructions. They're actually learning to improve their own capabilities in ways that we didn't explicitly program them to do.
So where does this all lead? I mean, were we on the verge of creating AI systems that are not only intelligent, but like self-aware? Should I be brushing up on my chess game just in case?
Well, I think it's safe to say we're not quite at the robot overlord stage just yet, but it's certainly something to think about, isn't it? What we do know is that this dance between matter and meaning, between physical processes and symbolic representation, this semantic closure, it's becoming increasingly complex and, well, consequential in our world. And that's something we all need to be aware of as we move forward.
That's for sure. It's a lot to wrap our heads around. So as we reach the end of our deep dive here, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that we're living in a time of extraordinary change, extraordinary discovery, really. We're witnessing the emergence of systems, both biological and artificial, that are capable of learning, evolving in ways that honestly were once considered the exclusive domain of science fiction.